Hello, everybody.
Turn this up in my headphones, Charles.
Turning it up. Hello, everybody, one and all. Welcome to another very exciting episode of the Friends Talking Fantasy podcast. My name is Charles, and with me today, as always, is my lifelong friend and co-host, Dylan.
I'm ready to talk some fantasy with my friend, Charles.
I'm ready to talk some fantasy with my friend as well, Dylan, but not just any old fantasy. Today, we are bringing back the character series with, as you could see from the title, anti-heroes that won our hearts.
Right. By popular demand.
By popular demand, the character series is back. We've done protagonists. We've done antagonists. We've done just characters we like. And now we're starting to dig a little deeper into the barrel here, and we're pulling out anti-heroes.
Yeah, well, it felt appropriate because we'd basically done more straightforward protagonists. Some of them were anti-heroes, if I'm remembering correctly, but whatever.
Yeah.
And we've also done some straightforward antagonists or villains. None of them were anti-heroes. None of them were heroic really at all. And we're like, okay, well, what's the middle ground here, Charles? It's the anti-hero.
Yes.
I think it's time that we dive into the ones that won our hearts.
Let's do it. Let's talk about those anti-heroes that won our hearts. And won them they have. We're trying something new with the character series. Instead of like us presenting characters to each other and like we each only pick a couple, we're just going to like talk through a whole list of them. Just, we're not going to spend as much time on each one or making themes with each one or like picking one that we personally like or whatever. It's just kind of like, hey, let's just talk about a bunch of anti-heroes, and now we can talk about more characters, more books, just more fantasy in general.
Yeah, Charles and I were thinking that this is friends talking fantasy, not friend talking fantasy, and sometimes those previous way of doing the character episodes would start being just like one of us talking for a while and the other one listening, and then be like, ooh, that's nice, that sounds like a good character, and then going. We think this will facilitate a little bit more conversation about the characters and hopefully feel more just like conversations with your friends rather than not that the previous ones were stilted, but maybe just a bit.
And you know what? We'd be curious to know what you think. We're kind of guessing with this one. We're trying something. We think it will be better. But, at the end of the day, it's the fans that decide what's better. So if you like this new format, if you like the old format, reach out, let us know. We're trying to make an improved show always, every week. So, just hit us up.
That's a goal. We love feedback. We
do,
try to react to it to the best of our abilities. But how about we get into this, Charles, without further ado, as you like to say.
Let's do it. And before you get the chance to talk, I'm bringing up Joe Abercrombie. Dylan is the diehard Abercrombie fan. I like Abercrombie as well. When you talk about anti-heroes, I'm going to steal a little bit of Dylan's thunder and say that one of the reasons we both love Joe Abercrombie so much is because he's pretty much a master when it comes to writing anti-heroes.
Exactly, Charles. I know when we're talking about this episode, you're saying, well, in general, one of the people you think of is Walter White when you think of anti-heroes.
Yeah, he's my favorite anti-hero in fiction. But yeah, he's a good example of one, I should say.
Right. And maybe we ought to sort of define anti-hero as well before we get into how Joe Abercrombie masterfully illustrates how to write strong anti-heroes. I'd say I pretty much looked up on Wikipedia It says an anti-hero or anti-heroine is a main character in a story who lacks conventional heroic qualities and attributes such as idealism, courage, and morality. Although anti-heroes may sometimes perform actions that are morally correct, is not always for the right reasons, often acting primarily out of self-interest or in ways that defy conventional ethical codes. And I would say when it comes to Joe Abercrombie and these characters that he writes in those more main character positions, just about all of them buck the typical heroic qualities such as idealism, courage, and morality to various extents. The two that most come to mind, I think, as great illustrations of anti-heroes are Logan Ninefingers, and that's probably my favorite character, maybe in all fiction.
He's a great
And
pick.
yeah, and Glokta is another big fan favorite. So Logan Ninefingers is a barbarian with a bit of a, I would say, philosopher's spirit and a warrior's cynicism and
Demeanor.
attitude and willingness to get things done. And then Glokta is actually a torturer, which takes him far outside the realm of what you would typically expect from a protagonist or
Someone
quote-unquote
he can
hero.
be rather kind of charming, or in a way, I would kind of say, like, he seems like he's like a witty guy. He's fun to read. He seems like a nice guy, but then you forget that what he's doing in the scene is like torturing somebody, you know? So very dichotomous there.
Exactly. I think when people read Glokta, they're often very taken by like his internal monologue has this great dry humor
Yeah.
to it. We've said before, if you really like Tyrion, then I think Glokta is a character that you'd really enjoy, has that kind of dry sense of humor. But what makes Glokta much more of an anti-hero than is Tyrion is the fact that, like, Tyrion would be, I think, pretty unlikely to just dive into torturing people in the way that Glokta is willing to do. And while Glokta does question the morality of these actions, he has reached a point of like pessimism or even hopelessness, it seems at times, about the world and how dark a place it is. And they call Joe Abercrombie Lord Grimdark for a reason. It's such a dark world that for Glokta to make his way in it, as someone who also deals with a lot of disabilities, he's got to do what it takes and be ruthless. And though he'll question, like he's constantly questioning, why do I do this? That's a big part of his internal monologue. He does it anyway. And that's such a big part of what makes him an anti-hero.
Yeah, I was going to bring up the point that he himself was like, this dashing hero type back in the day, and then he himself was tortured, and now he's like, has all kinds of like health issues, and he's in pain constantly, and that kind of gives him a little sympathy points. But then he's like, walking into interrogation room and starts torturing someone in like graphic detail. So it's kind of, you don't know kind of how to feel in those moments. And then, like you said, we love reading his internal monologue. It's very Tyrion-esque, but unlike Tyrion, Glokta is capable of devising some really like horrible plans and doing more like personal horrible things to people, and that kind of what gives him a little bit of edge in terms of like being an anti-hero.
For sure, Charles. You make such an interesting point there about Glokta as someone who used to be. Sorry, who used to be. Yeah, I'm coughing on the podcast. But someone who used to be a traditional hero. Actually, I mean, maybe not in the sense, like he was a pretty narcissistic person in a lot of ways. But definitely had a lot of the courage elements, if we're going with those three bits. He had courage to the point where he thought he could do everything, and he looked the part of a hero. He was an amazing fighter. Everyone admired him and those kind of things.
Mm-hmm.
And we get to see him illustrate how someone who, at least from the outside, kind of looks like a hero, then can become an anti-hero when the world pretty much shows them, hey, you can't go around acting with that much courage and and be able to make it through.
It's so true. I think, a lot of modern fantasy kind of tries to adopt these ideas. It's like we know the knight in shining armor, we know the hero, we know how virtuistic the hero should be in a good versus evil story. And a lot of what the modern popular fantasy authors are doing is kind of exploring the more human nature, the more like gray morality, the more violent tendencies of like what a real a setting more based in reality would be like. And something that's on the cutting edge of modern fantasy that's along those same lines is a book that we just read. It's the Poppy War series, and this antagonist is none other than Rin.
You mean
Or not
anti-hero?
antagonist,
Although sometimes it's
anti-hero.
hard, yeah,
Depends what
hard
side
not
you're on.
to see. Yeah. And isn't that what anti-heroes are all about, Charles?
That's right.
Yeah, so we've talked Rin almost to death on this
Yeah.
podcast,
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah.
Right? We've said so much. We love the Poppy War trilogy by R.F. Kuang, and I think we no need to go too deep into
No.
Rin here because there's so much you could hear us talking about if you go to our Poppy War trilogy episodes or our why we have to read the Poppy War. But for those who haven't listened to those, Rin, incredibly ruthless, incredibly relentless, incredibly ambitious, and incredibly interesting to read about because she holds all of those qualities. She's another one that's super hard not to find yourself rooting for, even when she's doing some really horrible things. And
Right.
yeah, what do
I
you
would
think it is
say,
about
like,
Rin
even
that
beyond Logan Nine Fingers and Glocta, like, they have some characteristics about them that we like. With Rin, this is who we are with. This is who is presented to us as the main character in the story. So we've talked in depth about this idea of like we're rooting for her and we applaud her character development, but all of her development and growth is like problematic and destructive in nature. So, that's what's so fascinating about Rin is that we are so excited to see her like grow and overcome things, but she's giving off all these warning signs and violent tendencies as well, and that's what makes her such an interesting modern anti-hero. She also, the way she interacts with authority is really complex and interesting, and the way she like fits that role of what's expected from her and what she wants and what she's willing to do to get to where she needs to go is what makes her a great example. I'm trying to avoid spoilers here, is what makes her like a really interesting anti-hero in modern fantasy.
For sure. One of the big things that we've talked about here, Charles, is that when Rin goes through that growth you were mentioning, Charles, as an anti-hero, her growth is overcoming her own psychological barriers, if you will, that keep her from enacting some of the things that she'd like to enact. But that doesn't necessarily mean that she becomes a better person, despite the personal and psychological growth. And that we've always found very interesting about Rin and how she contrasts from characters in books that are written by authors who tend to go a little more optimistic, like Brandon Sanderson tends to write a little bit more optimistic. Character growth is often going to make you a better person if you're in a Brandon Sanderson novel.
Right. Very true. Who should we talk about next?
Well, I've been wanting to bring up Micah Halfwolf from Monstrous by Marjorie Liu and Sana Takeda.
Now you better avoid spoilers because I just bought the first volume and I'm gonna pick it up soon.
I know, Charles. Well, this is a spoiler-free episode, so we ought to be able to hold to that, and you'll be a good canary in the coal mine to see if I
you better.
end up saying anything that feels like a spoiler here. So these are just critically lauded graphic novels that I was lucky enough to have recommended to me by Beth Tabler over on Twitter. So follow her. She gave some great recommendations. We're not huge graphic novel guys necessarily here on the Friends Talking Fantasy podcast. We love Saga, but we're just not that well read. We're a
Yeah,
lot
I was gonna
better
say we're
read when it
not
comes
well
to
read. We are fans, but our experience
yes.
is limited.
Well said, Charles. We've liked a lot of what we've read, and Saga sticks out, but we just don't have a lot of things to draw from when it comes to talking graphic novels.
Mm-hmm.
This has been awesome foray into a sort of grimdark setting in a graphic novel medium, Charles, and I am still moving through the series. I think I just finished up the third volume over here. The main character, Micah Half-Wolf, has been just risen up the ranks pretty quick to one of my favorite characters I've read
Wow.
in any form of fantasy. It's, like I said, a very grimdark world, and Micah Half-Wolf has to navigate all of these things, has experienced a lot that has made her rightfully cynical about the world in the same way that some of these Joe Abercrombie type characters get cynical about the world because of how dark it is. And she's had to figure out, okay, well, I'm a teenage girl in all of this. I am going to have to do what it takes to survive. And I think it's not a spoiler to say that the book called Monstrous involves a character. This is in the blurbs oftentimes. It involves a character who has a link to a monster that's inside of her. And that monster, not shockingly, wants to do some pretty monstrous things. And you get to see how Micah, who I would say would prefer to do the right thing if that's possible, gets to try to manage the fact that this monster's inside her and wants to do some pretty messed up things. So how does she keep herself from doing things that are too messed up while also being willing to acknowledge when it's her who's making choices that aren't necessarily morally ethical? How's that? Did I manage it without any spoilers?
We'll see. We'll see. But she kind of reminds me, like when you were describing that, she kind of reminds me of a character in a series we're reading right now, or Nona, when she has, I don't want to spoil anything, but Nona has a similar issue where she's trying to decide like what would be justified by these dark influences on her and what is her herself, kind of separating those responsibilities, if you catch my meaning.
I do catch your meaning. I know exactly what you're getting at there, Charles, and I think we don't want to dive too deep into that.
Yeah,
Trust me, if you're willing to say that, Charles, what I said is 100% kosher about Monstrous. Check out Monstrous, though, y'all, and I know we're looking to do it soon on the
I'm going to be
podcast.
Reading it
soon. It's really good, and
yep,
there's like strong female characters that I have really appreciated. The world is really interesting too.
Right,
cool world.
It was recommended to you. You read it, and you I know you're like gushing over a lot of these characters because we're cherry picking the best ones, but it's pretty rare for you to gush as much as you have about Micah here. So I, a couple days ago, I went into a local comic book store. I found this shiny hardcover like book one thing with a couple volumes in it, and I'm haven't broken the seal off of it yet, but I'm excited to read that, and maybe we'll talk about it soon. Who knows?
Yeah, I'm looking forward to being able to get into it with some more spoilers because that was a hard one to navigate for me. But there's another character I like at least just as much for very different reasons in that book, Charles. But I won't get into in that graphic novel. So you're saying book?
Yes.
Yeah,
graphic.
So
novel.
Anyway, we probably ought to keep it moving.
Let's
Charles,
do it.
You got one that you want to mention?
Well, I guess the next one on my list, I was kind of, I'm like, is this character an anti-hero? And yeah, he technically is. I'm talking about Geralt of Rivia, another series that we've read on the show. and he came up in another character series that we did. I think it was Protagonists. Um, so I won't go too much into talking about Geralt of Rivia. I'm sure a lot of you know him from either the show or the video games or the books or whatever. He's pretty much consistent throughout all of those mediums as a character. But I'd say what was interesting about him is like, I guess if I were to picture like the hero version, like the pure hero version of Geralt, it would be someone like Robin Hood. You know, it's like, oh, I steal from the rich and give to the poor. And I have my merry men, and I'm like a cool guy. But you know, Geralt's not like that. He's got that anti edge to him. You know, he is not that great of a person sometimes. He can be a little selfish at times. He rejects a lot of the virtuistic parts of a hero. He kind of embraces the grittiness of reality sometimes. He's a violent guy by trade. He does, though, show a lot of moral virtue at certain points. You know, he has a very strict like moral code that he adheres to, often getting him in trouble with like human beings and trying to defend monsters against humans that want monsters dead. So it's a super interesting balance of what an antihero can be. Like an antihero can have like moral virtues and like defined values, but can still exhibit non-heroic traits. And I think Geralt, and of all the list of characters that we've mentioned, is probably the most heroic so far. I don't know about this Micah Halfwolf, but compared to like Glocta and Logan Nine Fingers and Rin, he's definitely more heroic. But
Yeah.
but what makes him an anti-hero is not how like dangerous or unhinged or the horrible things he does. It's like how much he kind of rejects the idea of a hero and how he navigates like a real world modern fantasy setting, and the moral conundrums that he's in and where he decides to draw the line and the consequences of those actions. He, can't stay faithful in relationships, all these other things that kind of round him out. And that's why I wanted to put him on the list.
Right. I think he totally counts as an anti-hero,
Yeah.
Charles. He's probably, like you said, the most heroic of the ones we've mentioned, though the bar is not super high there for with a few of those.
Yeah.
I think that he definitely has a lot of that courage, and he does have a moral code. He doesn't have a lot of that idealism with those three that we talked about.
Not very idealistic.
And I think the lack of idealism, as well as it's sort of his role, right? The fact that he's walking around and being perceived as monstrous by all these people around him is part of what makes him like, this isn't your typical hero. And throwing him into these fairy tale style stories, at least in the short stories, and seeing how he behaves differently from our typical heroes is very interesting.
Absolutely. And something I love about Geralt that I only appreciated in like my second read through of the short stories was his how self-deprecating he is. And there's this whole thing about like, oh, I'm a witcher, I don't have emotions, people hate me, and I'm just a mercenary and people are trying to use me, whatever. Like, so much of that he inflicts on himself to the point where he doesn't think he can have successful, meaningful relationships, whether that's with Ciri or Yennefer. It's not necessarily romantic relationships he doesn't think he can have. It's all personal relationships, and that's really interesting to watch him go through. Usually in a heroic role, characters are very confident, grandiose, or trying to raise their voice and things like that. And Geralt is like wallowing in his own self-pity, and it's not what the books are about, but when you think about it as you're reading those books, it dominates everything that he does and explains a lot of why he is the way he is. And that's, to me, what makes Geralt such an interesting anti-hero.
Well said, Charles. Geralt kind of reminds me of a character from this series called The Raven's Mark by Ed McDonald, named Ryholt Galharrow. And not just because Ryholt kind of sounds like Geralt. They're both people who get into a little bit of monster hunting. And Ryholt is a character that has to, in his role as a captain of his, basically there's like two warring gods in this series, and one of them has made Reinhold a captain of their forces. And part of what he has to do is go into this place called the Misery and fight monsters. The monsters in this series are a little bit more like they came from humans, a little more like zombie movie type feel to them. But he has those anti-hero traits in spades. He's first off like older than the typical heroes that we get. I think he's in his 30s, and
So
he's
old.
kind of but he is, I think, older than our typical heroes.
Not as old as
like, if you
Geralt.
look, not as old as Geralt. Geralt's been around a while, but if you look at some of these other, a little older than Rin, a little older than Micah Half-Wolf. But anyway, the idea is that he's kind of got this like beat up face to him. He also comes from more of this background where he used to be a little bit more heroic that I won't get into details of, and he's down on his luck, and he's just kind of in it for the money, a little bit like Geralt is at times, and trying to get the job done. And he's on the side of a pretty ruthless god king type figure. So he's very jaded, but he's also very complex in the sense that he tries to do the right thing, I think, when it's possible. But he's got that feel to him that I think I get from Geralt, where it's like when you have to get something done, you're gonna do it, and you're not gonna worry about what gets in the way. It's like when Geralt's trying to get access to a place at one point. I remember he's like, "Money opens all doors," and he just like hits the guy
With a bag of coins.
yeah, with a bag of coins.
Yeah.
And Reinhold is the kind of guy who would totally do that, and sometimes does things that are kind of unnecessarily sadistic in the ways that some of these other anti-heroes do.
Sounds kind of action-packed, too.
It is, yeah. And they're pretty quick books. I highly recommend them. I always recommend them as kind of, if you're a veteran fantasy fan and you like Joe Abercrombie, then I recommend Ed McDonald's work whenever I can, because I think it's pretty underrated. It's also got like a good sense of humor like Abercrombie's work.
Yeah, I've never heard of it, so it's sparked my interest for sure.
Yeah, first book's Blackwing. Check it out. It's like 300 pages. They're short. Yeah. I've got some more I'd love to talk about, Charles, if I can.
Yeah, I'm looking at the list. I think there's one more on here from a series I haven't read, so I may as well get that out of the way and go for it, man.
Don't be too pumped there, Charles.
I'm still kind of triggered from your ageist comment earlier about an old 30-year-old as someone who's almost.
That's not how I said it, Charles. I said he's older than our typical. Our typical heroes, and I think that's fair. It is the fantasy genre that is occasionally ageist in terms of so many young characters.
I know, it's like, why do they all have to be like late, in their teens or 20s or whatever? We need some more older people in fantasy.
Charles, especially as you start getting up there in age, a little bit older than I am.
I know. I might be sounding a little insecure right now, but it is what it is. It's like we're not just like, the wise mentor figure that dies in the second act of the first book. There's more to us than that.
More to you anyway, Charles.
Thank you. So let's do it, man. I'm pumped for this one. This is probably the series I've talked most about without having read a single word. It's got to be this series.
Okay, well, then I know you're telling me let's talk about Locke Lamora from The
Yep,
Gentleman Bastard sequence by Scott Lynch,
that's right.
beginning with The Lies of Locke Lamora. I think he's one of the characters that most come to mind for me when we're talking about anti-heroes in the fantasy genre. You know, he's a rogue, he's a thief, it's all these kind of things. And he is definitely conniving is probably a very good word for Locke. He's uh, a very, very clever character. The book pretty much starts off with uh, he's being sold from this person who trains thieves because he's like he steals too much. Like I can't get him to stop. So
That's
uh,
funny.
yeah, the books are very, very they're dark in tone, but the characters are hilarious. The dialogue is super witty, the banter is great, and Locke basically ends up pretty early on. Not a spoiler. Locke is the head of a thieving crew that. They do a little bit of the Robin Hood type stuff of like, we steal from the rich, but also Locke is a lot more ruthless when push comes to shove than is any Robin Hood type character, and he, he's got a relentless appetite for stealing, and he's pretty willing to take vengeance when necessary. I'll say is that's my spoiler-free version.
Got it. Vengeance when necessary.
Yeah, I don't know how much deeper I can go into some of the things that Locke's on to do, but he's great to read about. He's like a lovable scoundrel in a lot of ways. I think like if you really like another great antihero, probably fair to say in fantasy, like Captain Jack Sparrow. Like if you
Who
really
doesn't
like
love
Captain Jack
Captain Jack
Sparrow,
Sparrow?
who doesn't? Or you love
That's
playing the
another
rogue
anti-hero that's captured our
for
hearts.
sure.
In the hearts of
Definitely,
America.
definitely captured our hearts. I love Captain Jack Sparrow,
Hmm.
and I think people who agree with us there would really enjoy Locke because he's just such a like funny rogue scoundrel type character.
Man, yeah, I mean, you've sold me on it a bunch of times. Maybe several weeks down the road, and we get to a friends pitching fantasy where you can pitch it again.
Can I even? I think I can't because
You
you
can for the
rejected it
next
last time
one,
again.
but the one afterwards, like months from now when we get there, who knows? Anything's possible.
Yeah, that is
But
that is
that's
fair,
at the
Charles.
top of
Anything's
my to be
possible.
read pile. It's just not fair that you've also put up like King Killer and Abercrombie and all these
Yeah,
other, it's just not fair, but we'll get there eventually.
we will get there, Charles.
Uh,
Are you?
yeah,
Go
man,
ahead.
I'm ready to move on. We've talked a lot about Mark Lawrence recently, particularly Book of the Ancestor, but you know, I'm not going to come out and say that this character's won my heart in terms of like a character that is worthy of love, but he's certainly a character that I love to read. And that is Jorg from the Broken Empire. Jorg is, he's one of those protagonists who is absolutely ruthless. I mean, like, I like to think of it as like you're like leveling out like you have 100 points and then you have a bunch of different character traits. You have like, oh, kindness, friendliness, determination. It's like you pretty much put everything at 0 except for like just determination and pragmatism, and that's Jorg. He's absolutely cold, absolutely callous, but what is so much fun to read about him, he's like, what do I have to do to get from A to B? And then he's like, this is the most direct path. That's the path I'm committing to and I'm going to take. And Lawrence, his ability to write a character like that who's so determined and so pragmatic and watch that character solve problems, like, a heroic character would never go about these like Machiavellian brutal paths that Jorg goes through, and it's so entertaining to read. It is horribly violent, and he is a criminal and a a monster, but he's so interesting and entertaining, and I just haven't read another character quite like him in fantasy. It's just so much fun to read him problem solve and deal with forces he doesn't understand, but still figure out like, well, when you do this to this force, that thing happens, so I can basically use it. I don't care about if I can understand it or not. I just care if I can use it or not. And reading those kind of things in Book of the Ancestors, like a huge highlight for that series. And like I think anyone who, if that sounds interesting to you, I'm trying to think of other characters who are as like pragmatic. Like Rin, I guess, is a character who's very similar to that.
Rin without the vulnerability.
Yeah, yes, Jorg has no vulnerability whatsoever. He's not impressed by anybody.
Right. Yeah. The stuff you said about Jorg in terms of his willingness to do whatever it takes to get from point A to point B, that is what makes him stand so much in contrast to some of these like chosen one type heroes where I was like, like, I don't know, I don't want to be the chosen one. I don't know if I necessarily want to go do that. Oh no, like I've finally got the villain under like control over here, and I could kill them and probably save a lot of lives by doing that, but I'm a good person, so I just gotta let this person go even though I've killed all their henchmen.
Yeah.
It's like, after reading enough of that or seeing it in other medium too, you can get some catharsis almost out of watching Jorg, where it's like Jorg will never let the person go in that situation. Jorg will do
You won't even think
what
about
it takes
you won't
to
even delay.
achieve. Yeah,
like
it wouldn't come up.
the commitment and the like procedural kind of approach he'll take to it would be almost as disturbing as the act itself. Of like that's kind of the kind of character that Jorg is.
Exactly. So if you're, I mean, there's some real atrocities committed in that series and sexual violence and things like that, that it makes it not necessarily something that I think everyone would enjoy reading. So I want to give a heads up about that. I definitely am sooner to recommend The Book of the Ancestor by Mark Lawrence to most people than I am to recommend The Broken Empire, and I highly recommend.
Yeah, you got to get a
Book of the
feel for
Ancestor.
someone before you recommend Book of the Ancestor. They have to be okay
You mean,
with. A Broken Empire. They have to
Broken
be
Empire.
super chill with violence of all violence, and also I'd say you'd have to be a little more ready to pick up on the nuances of the setting and the characters and things like that. It's a bit more of a committed. You have to be focused and you have to be paying attention when you're reading Book of the Ancestor. But it's so much fun.
You mean Broken Empire?
Broken Empire. That's what I'm talking about. We've just been talking about Book of the Ancestor for so long. I'm on autopilot. Broken Empire. That's the series I'm talking about with Jorg. Read it if you're comfortable with violence, which I am. I don't mind a nice, fantasy violence. I'm very much on board with. So I enjoyed it. But yeah, I wouldn't just go recommending this to anyone.
No, but I would recommend Book of the Ancestor to just about anyone.
That's fair.
So if you're looking, check out Mark Lawrence, and Jorg sounds a little much for you, then definitely check that out. And our episodes on it.
Yes.
Plug.
Yes.
Yo.
We've got a lot of episodes coming out recently about Book of the Ancestor, so check those out. So it wouldn't be a character series without talking about Game of Thrones, Dylan. Just wouldn't be.
No, it would not, Charles.
And, I mean, you could pretty much put any of our protagonist POV characters in this anti-hero realm, but I'm really trying to think of the more interesting ones, because there's some characters that, are more of an antagonist. There's some characters that don't really fit the protagonist role, and there's some characters that may or may not betray spoilers. So it's like, which characters do you pick? And one that I feel comfortable picking is the Hound, actually. The Hound, kind of like Geralt of Rivia, maybe only a little bit more jaded and horrible, but this is a guy who is very much like, I'm serving this guy because, that's the smart thing to do, and I want to stay alive, and I want to be in power, and whatever. He goes through life pretty much as an individualist. He does have a little bit of a moral code, but he's been raised in Westeros, and that has hardened him quite a bit. And, he's done some pretty horrible things, but a lot of times the horrible things he does comes from like a pragmatic like influence, or stressor. It's like, well, it's like we can't help them and also survive ourselves. So we just have to kind of let them, go off on their own. They'll probably die, but we'll survive. And that's what we have to do. When like anyone would be like, oh, that's so cold. How could you do that? How could you not help them? It's like, you got to save yourself before you save others. And that's kind of an occasional theme that pops up with the Hound, and to see him with Arya sometimes, or with Sansa, or with any of the other main characters, there are always these fun moments because he does kind of walk that line. He's like, is he a nice guy? Is he dangerous though? And that's what makes him so fun to read. And although I wouldn't say he's like a hero in the story by any sense, he does kind of have some of those heroic tendencies, but he's very much in that anti-role. So I think people like him as a character, and even though he's in that gray morality very strongly.
The Hound's a great pick, Charles. There's an awesome quote by him where he says, "I'm honest, it's the world that's awful." And I think that's a common theme throughout what makes a lot of our great anti-heroes, is they're oftentimes in these very grim, dark worlds, like Westeros, like the Circle of the World in the first Law series, like everything Rin has to deal with in the Poppy War trilogy.
Right.
They're these terrible, terrible worlds around them, and part of how they're able to win our hearts when they do is that they're just doing what they have to do to get by with how messed up the world is. So we can start to empathize with, like, okay, well, if I was here, sure, I'd love to be like, I don't want to spoil anything from Game of Thrones by picking the character I want to pick.
Right.
But
right.
I'd love to be like some of the more heroic people that are present in this world, if they are present. But I don't know if I could pull that off.
Yeah.
Like, that takes so much strength to be like that in this world. So these anti-heroes become, in a lot of ways, a lot more relatable than they would be if they were in, let's say, a Tolkien-type world.
That's true. And the Hound has won our hearts multiple times because we see there's like almost a sensitive side to him. His backstory has a little bit of tragedy in it. And even though he's killed a lot of people, or worked for horrible people, or he has pretty he's like pretty okay with like, oh well, I guess these people are gonna die now, it's not my problem kind of attitude. He still captures our hearts many times, and I just think that's what makes him like such a great example of what an anti-hero can be.
Sure. Great pull with the Hound.
I'm trying, like, there's so much I want to talk about with the Hound, but it's like I don't want to get into anything that could be perceived as a spoiler. So I'm speaking very vaguely, but great character. And like there's other characters that I think might even better fit this role that I don't even want to say. I don't want to like betray, character arcs or things like that. I think the Hound's a safe pick.
Yeah, that's fair. I think good pick with the Hound, and if there's anyone else that you're feeling like you want to make sure to mention, then go for it. I think I'm fresh out.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many things with like all like. Yeah, no, I don't want to get into it. I'm good.
Charles, I think our next episode should be like 30 minutes of you waffling about whether or not you want to spoil things from Game of Thrones.
We just need to have an episode where we just talk about Game of Thrones spoiler stuff. It's like, let's just talk about Game of Thrones without having to worry about spoilers for 30 minutes. But
that would be nice. We could maybe do a best Game of Thrones character series that is just like, look, if you're listening to this, like, we're going to spoil Game of Thrones. But
we did just drop that recommendation thing about Game of Thrones, but this would actually get into the spoilers, which would be awesome. So maybe we'll see.
Yeah. It's so often that every time we're talking about Game of Thrones, right? It's like
Yeah, because it's been
spoiler-free,
years
basically.
since I've read any of those books. But when we start talking about the characters, I get so I'm surprised how into it I
Yeah,
get. I'm always surprised about how excited I get talking about Game of Thrones,
me
even
too.
after it's been years since I've read the books. It's been over a year since I've watched an episode of the show. But when we start talking about it in these character series and these recommendation series, it gets me pumped. And I kind of forget that this was like our first love in that we've been chasing the dragon ever since on Modern Fantasy after this series, and it's just
Nailed
kind
it.
of thank you the magic from all of that, and I just like talking about
Nailed
Game of
that too.
Thrones. Thank you. I'm just trying to not spoil anything so we can move on, but love Game of Thrones. All those characters are pretty much anti-heroes, but figured the Hound would be a nice
Yeah,
deep cut pick to pull out of there.
for sure. I mean, I'm with you, Charles. My kind of natural reaction when we start talking Game of Thrones is like at first I'm like, like the ending to the show,
Yeah,
this
yeah.
whole like sense of disappointment. But then once we start getting into the thick of the conversation, I'm all pumped up again
I know it's
too.
like, do I
So
want to watch an episode of the show? No. Do I want to
yeah,
crack open the books right now? Not really. But once we start talking about it, I'm like, oh, you know what? I kind of am into all that stuff still. Like, I still like all
I
of it.
feel the same way. Yeah, I know a
Surprises
lot
me
of
sometimes.
people were disappointed by the ending of the show, but it's such an amazing series with
Hmm.
so many great moments that once you kind of get past that first bit and start talking about it, you remember how much stuff there was that won our hearts, Charles.
Won our hearts 100%. I have one more character on this list. I guess so. It seems like we wrapped everything up so well, but I'm going to talk about it anyway.
I even said won our hearts, Charles.
I know. I was
Like,
like,
that was the perfect transition to you get the outro music pumping. We record that next episode, but
I know, but there's
here
one
you
more on
go.
the list, and it was one of mine. And we got so many of yours. So here we go. And after that beautiful, beautiful segue to the end, I'm gonna kind of jarringly shift gears and bring up one more character from a pretty unknown series. Like,
Beautiful.
I talked about this once before in an episode that we recorded forever ago, and we've banked and have not aired yet. But and that's from a series called The Acts of Cain, and we're talking about Cain. And he just comes to my mind right away when I think of anti-hero, and he's very much almost like a I think of like an 80s action hero kind of when I think of Kane, where it's almost like like a Schwarzenegger kind of like guy where he's badass and he's often in like these action piece like hot pursuit chases or intense battles or fighting lots of people or in all these like high stakes situations like crazy settings. But he's such a great character. He interacts with other characters in like a fantasy setting like no other hero or protagonist does, and the way he thinks about fighting people is super interesting, and the way his whole philosophy around violence is super interesting. This is a character who goes into detail about how it's better to attack someone while they're mid-sentence because they're not expecting it. So normally you'd expect like the villain to have a whole monologue and the hero to like lecture the villain and this exchange of ideas. But the villain in Acts of Cain, the villain would be like, "You fool, you came into my lair and I've now sprung my trap." But Cain would just
And
cut
then
you off.
Kane punches him in the throat.
Cain would headbutt him in the nose or something. So
Yeah.
it's super fun to read, super interesting, very exciting stuff. So if you like, if you're reading all this modern fantasy, like this is kind of a bummer. I wish there was more like exciting stuff going on. Then pick up Acts of Cain. You will not be disappointed. If you like 80s action movies, especially some of the more violent ones or the ones with lots of action, also pick up Acts of Cain as well. If you like science fiction, pick up Acts of Cain. And that's all I got to say about it, man. It's really good. Highly recommend it.
I recommend it too.
It's just fun.
I've read the first book in this one, Heroes Die, which is an incredible title.
Great name for a book, yeah.
Yeah, that's basically why I read it. And that's probably a pretty Heroes Die is probably a pretty appropriate title relevant to our anti-heroes.
That's so true. I can't believe I went on that
Right.
whole rant and didn't mention in a book in a episode
Yeah.
about anti-heroes that this book is called Heroes Die.
Yeah.
I'm glad you
much
made
like-
that point because I'm picturing all the fans of the book being like, dude, what are you talking about? You missed the main point. It's the book title.
Here. Yes. So I mean, my sense when I first heard the title Heroes Die was like, oh, I bet this is going to have an anti-hero because the point of the book seems to be that if you're just a straightforward hero, then you'd actually die in reality. So
Yeah. Heroic
I mean-
virtues will get yourself killed, essentially, is what the
Yeah.
title implies.
yeah, the extent to which that does or doesn't come through in the book, we won't say. But that was my sense when I first heard the title, and it made me pick it up. So, and you know, heroes die, Charles, but eventually all episodes must die as well. They must come to an end. So,
I liked your first wind down
yeah,
better.
well, you should let me close it out with that then.
But then we would have never heard our thoughts on Heroes Die and Kane. Yep.
What would the world do?
I had to,
without
you know,
hearing?
sometimes as a fantasy podcaster, you have to make these tough calls. And maybe the more virtuistic podcaster would have let you have that moment and ended it. But I'm that anti-podcaster that's not afraid to jar the tone of the show to bring out that last point, you know, to get the last word in.
Yeah, stay tuned for our upcoming Best Anti-Podcasters episode where
Gosh.
Charles will get a mention.
Yeah,
But
a
I, as a
podcast where
more
I talk about
straightforward
myself.
hero.
You're definitely not going to want to miss that.
Yeah.
Well, want to do some more winding down, Dylan, or should we just get right into the outro here?
Yeah, let's just chill, just hang.
Huh?
Talk about whatever comes up.
Yeah, you know, like we've read a lot of great fantasy over the years, and just so great that we have so many anti-heroes, protagonists, antagonists that we could draw on and just talk about fantasy for indefinitely.
Yeah, why even talk fantasy, Charles? Let's just talk about our days.
Oh gosh, man, I sat in so much traffic today coming home from work. It was
All right,
horrible.
that's-
But yeah, I think that's why we don't do that. All right. Thank you, everyone, for listening to yet another very exciting episode of the Friends Talking Fantasy podcast. This has been Charles and Dylan coming at you. If you like what you heard, if you like the new format for the character series, let us know on Twitter at the FTF podcast with the number 1 at the end, or Facebook and Instagram, which is just at the FTF podcast. You could also shoot us an email at the ftfpodcast@gmail.com. We really need to know what you guys think of this character series. You know, we're trying new stuff. We want to know what works, what doesn't. So let us know. If you like what you heard, toss 5 stars to our podcast, guys. All you Apple podcast listeners out there have the opportunity to go to our profile and rate our show 5 stars. I believe we're still sitting at 7 or 8 5-star reviews. So if you're listening and you like it, don't delay. We will notice these things and we will appreciate them profoundly. And you know what? It doesn't cost you anything to do it. So get out there and show us some love. Yeah, Google us. Go check out our website. All that good stuff. Anything else, Dylan?
I think you said it all, Charles.
Well, I think we said it all. And at that, I will leave you with these parting words. Thank you all for listening. And as always, go forth and conquer, friends.